The winter in Chicago did not care for social status. It bit just as hard into the tailored cashmere of a corporate executive as it did into the thin, donated layers of those seeking refuge in the subway tunnels. Inside the towering glass atrium of the Sterling Financial Plaza, the air was climate-controlled to a perfect 72 degrees, yet Marcus Sterling, the CEO, felt a chill that no furnace could touch. At 45, Marcus was the architect of an empire, a man whose name was synonymous with ruthless efficiency and solitary success. But as he stepped out of the private elevator, the vastness of the lobby felt like a mausoleum. His footsteps echoed on the polished marble. He was headed toward the exit, his driver waiting in a warm Mercedes outside, when a sound stopped him. It wasn't the usual hum of the ventilation or the distant murmur of security guards. It was a piano. In the corner of the atrium sat a Steinway & Sons grand piano, an ornamental piece of furniture rarely touched. Now it was speaking. The melody was haunting, a delicate, melancholic arrangement of a folk song Marcus hadn't heard in decades. He froze. The music didn't just fill the room, it seemed to vibrate against the glass walls, pleading for someone to listen. He turned his head and saw her. A woman, perhaps in her late 20s, sat on the bench. Her coat was oversized and frayed at the cuffs, stained with the salt and slush of the city streets. Beside her, a small girl, no older than 5, sat perfectly still, clutching a ragged teddy bear. The child's eyes were fixed on her mother's hands that moved with the grace of a professional, despite the redness of her knuckles from the cold. Marcus should have called security. The building was private property, and the unhoused problem was something he usually dealt with through charitable donations that kept him at a comfortable distance. But he couldn't move. The song reached a crescendo, a wave of grief and hope intermingled, before settling into a soft, lingering chord. "Who taught you that?" Marcus asked, his voice rasping in the silence. The woman jumped, her hands flying from the keys as if they had burned her. She looked up, her face a mask of pale exhaustion and sudden fear. She immediately reached for the little girl, pulling her close. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We just needed to get out of the wind, just for a minute. The door was being held open for a delivery, and I saw the piano." "The song," Marcus repeated, ignoring her apology. "Where did you learn it?" The woman looked down at the keys, a flicker of pride crossing her tired features. "I learned this song in a shelter," she said softly. "There was an old woman there, a piano teacher who had lost everything. She taught me to play to keep the noise of the world out, to keep my daughter, Lily, from hearing the arguments and the crying." Marcus looked at the girl, Lily. She was staring at him with a mix of curiosity and caution. For the first time in years, the coldness in Marcus's chest felt a hairline fracture. He wasn't a man of impulse, but the sight of this woman, a virtuoso in rags, playing a masterpiece in his temple of gold, broke something inside him. "Stay," Marcus said, as the woman began to stand. "Play one more." "Sir, we have to go," she said, glancing nervously at the security desk where a guard was finally beginning to approach. "I own this building," Marcus said, turning to wave the guard away with a sharp flick of his wrist. He looked back at her. "My name is Marcus, and I haven't heard music like that since my mother passed. Please, just one more." The woman, whose name was Sarah, looked at her daughter and then back at the man who held the keys to the city. She sat back down, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the ivory. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew she shouldn't be here. People like her didn't belong in places that smelled of expensive wax and success. But the piano had been an irresistible siren. For the last 6 months, her life had been a series of grey walls, thin cots, and the constant, low-level hum of anxiety. Playing the piano was the only thing that made her feel like Sarah again, rather than just case number 402. She began to play again, a different tune this time, something faster, more rhythmic, mirroring the frantic pace of the city outside. As she played, she closed her eyes. She forgot about the eviction notice that had started it all, the husband who had vanished when the debts piled up, and the terrifying night spent clutching Lily in the backseat of a car that eventually wouldn't start. Marcus watched her. He saw the way her shoulders relaxed as the music took over. He saw the daughter, Lily, start to hum along under her breath. It was a scene of pure domestic beauty, framed by the harshest of realities. "You're a professional," Marcus said when she finished. It wasn't a question. "I was a student at the conservatory," Sarah admitted, her eyes still on the keys. "A long time ago, before life happened. Now, I just try to make sure Lily eats every day. The music it's a luxury I can't afford, but it's the only thing I have left to give her." Marcus leaned against a marble pillar. He thought of his own life, the board meetings, the acquisitions, the endless pursuit of more that had left him with a penthouse that felt like a desert. He had everything, and yet listening to this woman who had nothing, he felt an overwhelming sense of poverty in his own soul. "Where are you staying tonight?" Marcus asked. Sarah hesitated. The truth was shameful. "The shelter on 4th is full." They had a pipe burst. "We were going to try the 24-hour library or maybe the train station." The thought of the small girl, Lily, sleeping on a plastic chair in a train station sent a jolt of genuine physical pain through Marcus. He didn't recognize himself. He was the man who cut budgets and fired hundreds without blinking, but the music had acted like a skeleton key, unlocking a door he had kept bolted since childhood. "No," Marcus said. "You won't be doing that. Not tonight." "Sir, we don't need charity," Sarah said, her voice regaining some of its steel. "I'm looking for work. I have interviews. It's just the timing." "It's not charity," Marcus lied, his mind racing. "I have a guest suite in my home. It's empty. It's always empty. I need someone to look after the house, a house sitter. It's a job." Sarah looked at him, her eyes narrowing. She had been on the streets long enough to know that help often came with a price. But as she looked into Marcus Sterling's eyes, she didn't see a predator. She saw a man who looked just as lonely as she was, despite his millions. "Why?" she asked. "Because," Marcus said, looking at the piano, "that song you played, it was my mother's favorite. I haven't heard it played with that much soul in 20 years. Consider it a retainer for a private concert." Lily tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Mommy, I'm cold." That was the breaking point. Sarah looked at her daughter, then back at Marcus. She nodded slowly. "Just for tonight, until I figure out my next move." "Tonight is a start," Marcus replied. The ride to Marcus's penthouse was silent. Sarah and Lily sat in the back of the leather-scented Mercedes, staring out at the blurred lights of Chicago. For Lily, it was like being in a spaceship. For Sarah, it was a terrifying dream from which she expected to wake up at any moment, back on a cold sidewalk. When they arrived at the penthouse, the doors opened to a world Sarah had only seen in movies. It was a sprawling, minimalist space of glass, dark wood, and original art. It was beautiful, but it was cold. "This is Mrs. Holloway," Marcus said, introducing a kind-faced woman in her 60s who appeared from the kitchen. "She helps me run the place. Mrs. Holloway, this is Sarah and Lily. They'll be staying in the East Suite for the time being. Please see that they have everything they need. Food, warm clothes, whatever is required." Mrs. Holloway didn't blink an eye. She had seen Marcus in many states, but never this. Agitated, almost nervous. She looked at Sarah and Lily, and her expression softened instantly. "Of course, Mr. Sterling. Come along, dear, let's get you both into a warm bath and some dinner." As Sarah followed the housekeeper, she turned back to Marcus. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus only nodded, watching them disappear down the long hallway. He went to his bar and poured himself a glass of scotch, but he didn't drink it. He sat in his designer chair, looking out at the skyline. For the first time in years, the silence of his home didn't feel heavy. It felt like an intermission. The next few days were a blur of adjustments. Sarah was hesitant to touch anything, terrified that a single broken vase would send them back to the streets. But Mrs. Holloway was a patient guide. She showed Sarah how to use the high-tech kitchen and brought Lily a collection of books and toys that seemed to appear from nowhere. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself coming home earlier. He told himself it was to check on his investment, but in reality he was chasing the sound of the piano. He had moved a smaller upright piano into the East Suite, and every evening he would stand outside the door, listening as Sarah practiced. One evening he knocked. "Come in," Sarah said. She was sitting at the bench, Lily colouring on the floor nearby. Sarah looked healthier. The dark circles under her eyes had begun to fade, and her hair had regained its luster. "I spoke to some people," Marcus said, leaning against the doorframe, "in the music industry. I have a friend who runs a small, prestigious booking agency for private events and high-end hotels." Sarah froze. "Marcus, I told you I can't—" "I told him about the song," Marcus interrupted. "I told him about the way you play. He wants to hear you. He's holding auditions for a residency at the Drake Hotel next week." Sarah felt a surge of hope so intense it felt like vertigo. "The Drake? That's impossible. I don't even have a dress. I don't have a resume anymore." "You have the music," Marcus said firmly. "The rest is just logistics. I've already taken the liberty of arranging a stylist. And as for Lily, Mrs. Holloway is already planning a tea party for the afternoon of your audition." Sarah stood up, walking toward him. She stopped just a few feet away, her eyes searching his. "Why are you doing this? Truly?" Marcus looked down at his hands. "Because for years I've used my money to build walls, to keep people out, to keep the world at bay. When I heard you play, I realized those walls weren't protecting me. They were burying me, helping you. It feels like I'm digging myself out." Sarah reached out, her hand grazing his sleeve. "You're a good man, Marcus Sterling, even if you try very hard to hide it." As the date of the audition approached, the reality of Sarah's situation began to weigh on her. It wasn't just the pressure of the performance. It was the fear that her past would catch up with her. In the world of the unhoused, you learn that nothing good lasts without a fight. One afternoon, while Marcus was at the office, Sarah was walking Lily in a nearby park. She felt a prickle of unease, a sensation of being watched. She turned quickly, but saw only the usual joggers and dog walkers. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Lily asked, sensing her mother's tension. "Nothing, baby. Let's just head back," Sarah said, tightening her grip on Lily's hand. When they returned to the penthouse, Sarah found Marcus in the study, looking uncharacteristically grim. On his desk was a series of folders. "We have a problem," Marcus said, his voice low. Sarah's heart sank. "Is it the audition? Did they cancel?" "No," Marcus said. "It's about your former husband, James." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. James, the man who had gambled away their savings, who had signed papers he shouldn't have, and then disappeared when the creditors started knocking on their door. "What about him?" she whispered. "My security team does a background check on anyone staying in my home. It's standard procedure," Marcus explained. "It turns out James didn't just disappear. He's been looking for you, not because he wants to be a father, but because he's in deep with some very unpleasant people. He thinks you have the remaining money from your grandmother's estate, the money he couldn't get his hands on." Sarah sat down hard in a leather chair. "I don't have it. I used it all to pay off his first round of debts. There's nothing left. That's why we ended up on the street." "I know that," Marcus said, his eyes flashing with a protective anger that surprised them both. "But he doesn't. And he's seen you. My team caught him loitering near the building today. He's been tracking you since you left the shelter." Sarah covered her face with her hands. "I knew it was too good to be true. I've brought trouble to your door, Marcus. I should leave. I'll take Lily, and we'll go to a different city." Marcus walked around the desk and knelt in front of her. He took her hands away from her face, forcing her to look at him. "You are not going anywhere. You have an audition in 3 days. You have a daughter who finally feels safe. And you have me." "But he's dangerous," Sarah cried. "He's a bully," Marcus countered. "And bullies don't know what to do when they hit a real wall. I've spent 20 years being the most formidable wall in this city. Let me handle James. You focus on the music. Promise me." Sarah looked into Marcus's eyes. She saw a strength there that wasn't just about money or power. It was about character. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to be the only one fighting. "I promise," she whispered. That night, Marcus made a few phone calls. He didn't call the police, not yet. He called his head of security, a man named Elias, who had formerly been with Special Forces. "Elias," Marcus said into the phone, looking out at the city lights, "I have a pest problem at the front gate. I want it handled quietly, legally, but permanently. No one touches the woman or the child. Understood? Understood, Mr. Sterling, the voice replied. The 2 days leading up to the audition were a whirlwind. Marcus didn't just provide a place to stay, he provided a transformation. He hired a retired concert pianist, a stern but brilliant woman named Madame Valeska, to coach Sarah. You have the soul, child, Valeska told Sarah during an intense session in the penthouse. But your technique is rusty. You play like someone who is afraid the piano will be taken away. You must play like you own the air in this room. Sarah practiced until her fingers ached. Between sessions, she spent time with Lily, who was thriving under Mrs. Holloway's care. The little girl was eating well, her cheeks had turned pink, and she was no longer jumping at loud noises. Marcus was a constant, quiet presence. He would sit in the shadows of the room while Sarah practiced, sometimes working on his laptop, but often just watching her. They had dinner together every night, a family dynamic that felt strangely natural. I'm nervous, Sarah admitted on the eve of the audition. They were sitting on the balcony, wrapped in heavy coats, watching the snow fall over the Chicago River. Don't be, Marcus said. I've seen you play when you thought no one was watching. That's the Sarah the world needs to hear, the one who survived. What if James shows up? She asked, the fear still lingering in the back of her mind. He won't, Marcus said firmly. Elias has dealt with it. James was offered a choice, a very generous one-way ticket to a rehabilitation facility in another state, and a legal agreement to never contact you again, or a very long conversation with the district attorney about his fraudulent activities. He chose the ticket. Sarah felt a massive weight lift off her chest. You bought him off? I invested in your peace of mind, Marcus corrected. There's a difference. Sarah turned to him. The cold air was crisp, and the city lights reflected in Marcus's eyes. I don't know how to repay you for all of this. The music is enough, Marcus said. But as he looked at her, he knew it was a lie. He wanted more than the music. He wanted the life she had brought into his home. He wanted the laughter in the hallways and the sense of purpose that came with protecting them. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered there for a second too long to be just friendly. Sarah didn't pull away. Tomorrow, Marcus said softly, you show them who you are. The Drake Hotel was the epitome of Chicago elegance. Gold leaf, heavy drapes, and a history that whispered of royalty and movie stars. Sarah stood in the wings of the Gold Coast ballroom, wearing a simple but stunning midnight blue silk dress that Marcus had chosen for her. Her heart was racing so fast, she feared she might faint. In the front row sat the committee, 3 men and 2 women who looked like they hadn't smiled since the 90s. Among them was Arthur Penhaligon, the agent Marcus had mentioned. Marcus was there too, sitting off to the side, his presence a silent anchor. He caught her eye and gave a small, barely perceptible nod. Next, a voice called out, Sarah Jenkins. Sarah stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, blinding her for a moment. She walked to the center, sat at the massive 9-foot concert grand and took a deep breath. She didn't look at the judges. She looked at her hands. She started with a classical piece, Chopin's Winter Wind. It was a display of technical brilliance, her fingers flying across the keys with a ferocity that startled the committee. But then she transitioned. Without a pause, she moved into the folk song she had played that first day in the lobby. The shelter song. She played it with everything she had. She played the cold nights, the hunger, the fear for her daughter, and the sudden miraculous warmth of a stranger's kindness. The room went dead silent. Even the catering staff stopped moving. When she finished, the silence stretched for an agonizing 10 seconds. Then Arthur Penhaligon stood up. He didn't clap. He just stared at her. Where have you been, Miss Jenkins? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. I've been... Away, Sarah replied, her voice steady. Well, Arthur said, looking at his colleagues who were all nodding. The residency starts on the 1st of the month, but I suspect you won't be playing in hotel lobbies for very long. You belong in a concert hall. Sarah walked off the stage in a daze. Marcus was waiting for her in the wings. Before she could say a word, she threw her arms around him. He held her tight, the scent of her hair and the warmth of her body filling his senses. You did it, he whispered. I told you. "We did it," she corrected, pulling back to look at him. They walked out of the hotel as the sun was setting, the snow beginning to fall again. But this time, the cold didn't feel threatening. It felt like a celebration. The transition from the penthouse to Sarah's new apartment on Dearborn Street was more than a physical move. It was an emotional recalibration. Success had come with a dizzying speed that made Sarah feel like she was suffering from a permanent case of vertigo. The piano mom of the Drake was no longer a hidden gem. She was a local sensation. Every evening at the hotel, the lounge was packed with Chicago's elite city tourists, and even music students who sat on the floor just to watch her hands. Sarah was finally earning a living, a substantial one. She had saved enough for a down payment on a 2-bedroom apartment. It wasn't a glass fortress like Marcus's, but it had character. Exposed brick, large windows that looked out over the L train tracks, and a small nook perfectly sized for an upright piano. However, moving out felt like tearing a bandage off a wound that hadn't quite healed. On the final evening, the atmosphere in the penthouse was thick with unspoken words. Lily was inconsolable, clinging to Mrs. Holloway's apron strings. The housekeeper had become the grandmother the girl never had, teaching her how to bake cookies and telling her stories about old Chicago. "Lily doesn't want to leave, Mrs. Holloway," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the nearly empty East Suite. "And I've grown used to the view, or maybe just the feeling of being safe." Marcus stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her. The city lights flickered below like a sea of diamonds, but he looked solitary, framed by the immense dark glass. "You don't have to leave, Sarah. You know that. This place is 20,000 square feet. It's big enough for 10 families, and it's certainly big enough for you and Lily." Sarah walked over to him, her reflection ghosting alongside his on the glass. "I need to stand on my own feet, Marcus. If I stay here just because I'm afraid of the world outside, then I haven't really recovered. You've given me the wings, but if I never leave the nest, I'll never know if I can actually fly." Marcus turned to face her. In the dim light, he looked different. Older, perhaps, but also more human. The sharp, cold executive who had greeted her in the lobby a year ago was gone. "I'm afraid that if you leave, the silence will come back," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I've realized I don't like the silence anymore. I've spent 20 years perfecting it, and now it just feels like a void." Sarah took his hands, her warmth a sharp contrast to his cold fingers. "The silence won't come back unless you let it. We're only 6 blocks away, and Lily has already decided that you are her Uncle Marcus. She's already made a list of the school plays and birthdays you are required to attend." Marcus smiled, a genuine warm expression that reached his eyes. "I think I can handle a few school plays, but the transition wasn't just about moving boxes. The media had begun to sniff around. A local tabloid, the Windy City Insider, published a scathing piece titled "The Billionaire's Project." The article was a cynical take on their relationship, suggesting that Sarah was merely a PR pawn Marcus was using to soften his image before a controversial corporate merger. They dug into her past, bringing up the eviction and the debt, painting her as a calculated grifter rather than a talented artist. Sarah sat in her new apartment, the newspaper spread across the kitchen counter. She felt sick. "They're making it sound like a business deal, Marcus. Like I'm a project you bought to make your stock prices go up." Marcus, who had dropped by with a housewarming gift of expensive coffee, remained unfazed. He had been a target of the press for decades. "Let them talk, Sarah. They can't hear the music through a newspaper. They don't know about the nights you practiced until your fingers bled. We know what this is. That's all that matters." "But what is this, Marcus?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet. The question hung in the air, heavier than the city's humidity. They were more than friends, yet the shadow of their vastly different worlds, his of gold, hers of grit, still loomed large. Marcus looked at her, his eyes filled with an intensity that made her breath catch, but the words stayed trapped behind his teeth. For now, the music would have to speak for them. As Sarah's career matured, she refused to let her fame be a hollow achievement. She knew that for every piano mom, there were thousands of women still trapped in the cycle of the shelter system. She founded the Shelter Song Project, a non-profit dedicated to placing instruments in community centers and providing music therapy to displaced families. Music isn't a luxury, Sarah told a crowd of donors at a black tie gala. It's a lifeline. When you have lost your home, your job, and your dignity, music is the only thing that reminds you that you still have a soul. Marcus was the primary benefactor, providing the seed money and the corporate connections to make the foundation a reality. He watched from the back of the room as Sarah navigated the crowd. She was a natural leader, moving with a grace that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with survival. However, fame in the digital age brought a darker side. Sarah began receiving letters at the Drake Hotel. At first they were fan mail, but they quickly turned obsessive. A man who identified himself only as the listener began sending her detailed accounts of her daily routine, what she wore to the park, what time she picked Lily up from school, and how he believed they were destined to be together in the song. Elias, Marcus's security chief, brought the files to Marcus's office. "It's escalating, sir. We've spotted a man matching the description loitering near her new apartment on Dearborn. He's not a professional. He's a stalker who has romanticized her struggle." Marcus felt a cold, sharp rage. It was a protective instinct so primal it surprised him. "Double the security on her apartment. I want a shadow on her and the girl 24 hours a day. Find out who he is, and I want him away from her before she even knows he exists." "Understood," Elias said. Marcus tried to keep it from Sarah. He didn't want to dampen her spirit or make her feel like a prisoner again. He began inventing reasons to stay at her apartment, ostensibly to consult on foundation business, but in reality he was standing guard. He would stay late into the night, sitting on her sofa with a laptop, listening for every creak in the hallway. One rainy Tuesday night, Sarah caught him. She had woken up to get a glass of water and found Marcus at the door, peering through the peephole and checking the deadbolt for the third time in an hour. "Marcus, tell me the truth," she said, her voice firm. "You don't come over here at 2 a.m. to discuss budget spreadsheets. What's going on?" He sighed, the weight of the secret finally breaking him. He showed her the latest letter from the listener. Sarah sank onto the sofa, her face turning a ghostly pale. The letter was a rambling poem about cleaning the stains of the city from her life. "It never ends, does it?" she whispered. "I thought I was safe. I thought we were done with the fear." "Not this time," Marcus said, sitting beside her and taking her hand. "I told you once before, I am a wall. I have the resources to ensure this person never gets within 100 yards of you." "I'm tired of being protected, Marcus," Sarah said suddenly, her eyes flashing with a mix of fear and defiance. "I spent years being a victim of circumstances, a victim of my ex-husband, a victim of the system. I don't want to be a victim of your protection either. I want to be a partner. I want to know the truth so I can face it. Don't manage my life from a distance. Face the shadows with me." Marcus looked at her, truly seeing her. He realized that by hiding the truth, he was treating her like a fragile object, rather than the woman who had survived the streets of Chicago with a child on her hip. He had been trying to build a cage for her, even if the bars were made of silk. "You're right," he said softly. "I'm sorry, from now on no secrets. We handle the threats as a team." The stalker was apprehended a week later. Thanks to the coordinates provided by Elias and the cooperation of the Chicago Police Department, the man was picked up while waiting outside Lily's school. He was a disturbed individual, a former music teacher who had lost his grip on reality. With the threat removed, a profound sense of relief washed over Sarah's life, but it also brought a moment of clarity. To celebrate the first anniversary of the day they met, Sarah decided to do something unconventional. She didn't want a gala at the Drake or a televised concert. She wanted to go back to where it all began. She arranged a public concert of hope in the lobby of the Sterling Financial Plaza. She invited everyone, the residents of the shelter on 4th Street, the donors of her foundation, the office workers who hurried through the lobby every day, and the press. The lobby was transformed. The sterile corporate atmosphere was softened by hundreds of candles and rows of simple chairs. People who wore $5,000 suits sat next to people wearing donated flannels. It was a microcosm of the city Sarah loved, a bridge between the worlds of haves and have-nots. Sarah sat at the Steinway & Sons grand piano. She looked out at the audience, her heart swelling. She saw Mrs. Holloway holding Lily's hand in the front row. She saw the women from the shelter, their faces lit with a rare spark of pride. And then she saw Marcus. He was standing near the same marble pillar where he had first frozen in his tracks a year ago. "A year ago, I was a ghost in this building," Sarah said, her voice projected through the high-quality sound system. "I came in here to escape the wind. I didn't think anyone would hear me. I thought I was invisible. But one man stopped. He didn't see a homeless problem. He saw a person. He heard a song. And he reminded me that I was still alive." She began to play. She started with the original Shelter song, the melody that had first captured Marcus's soul. But as she played, she began to improvise. The music evolved from a lonely, singular melody into a complex, percussive, and triumphant anthem. It wasn't just a song about a shelter anymore. It was a song about the city, about the resilience of the human spirit, and about the unexpected beauty of a stranger's hand. As the final chord resonated through the glass atrium, the silence that followed was absolute. Then the room erupted. It wasn't just polite applause, it was a roar of catharsis. Marcus walked up to the stage as the crowd cheered. He didn't care about the cameras or the tabloid reporters. He reached out his hand and Sarah took it, stepping down from the piano bench. "You changed my life, Sarah Jenkins," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I was successful by every metric the world cares about, but I was empty. You filled the space." "We changed each other, Marcus," she replied, her eyes bright with tears. Under the bright lights of the lobby he built, Marcus did something he had never done in public. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a PR stunt. It wasn't a business deal. It was the final note of a long, difficult symphony that had finally found its resolution. 2 years passed. The fairy tale had transitioned into a beautiful, grounded reality. The Sterling Jenkins Foundation had expanded to 3 other major cities, becoming a gold standard for holistic support for the unhoused, combining housing with the arts and mental health services. Sarah was now a recording artist, her albums topping the classical crossover charts, but she still insisted on playing free concerts in city parks every summer. Marcus had undergone a radical transformation. He was still a brilliant businessman, but he had divested from companies that prioritized profit over people. He had become the city's most vocal advocate for social reform. He was no longer the billionaire recluse. He was a man often seen in the local parks, pushing a swing or carrying a tired little girl on his shoulders. They lived in a sprawling, warm home in Lincoln Park. It was a house filled with light, books, and of course music. On a crisp autumn evening, Marcus returned home from a board meeting at the foundation. As he opened the front door, he was greeted not by silence, but by the clumsy, beautiful sound of a piano. He walked into the music room. Lily, now 7 years old, was sitting at a small upright piano. Sarah was sitting behind her, her arms wrapped around her daughter, guiding Lily's small hands across the keys. "Steady, Lily," Sarah whispered. "Let the song breathe. Don't rush it." Marcus leaned against the doorframe, 2 cups of cocoa in his hands. He watched them for a long time, savoring the scene. He thought back to the cold night in the plaza, the frayed coat, and the smell of the winter wind. It felt like a lifetime ago. "How's the lesson going?" Marcus asked, stepping into the room. Lily turned around, her face lighting up. "Daddy, listen, I learned the bridge to the Shelter song." Marcus sat on the bench on the other side of Lily. "Show me." As the little girl played a simplified version of the melody that had saved their lives, Marcus looked at Sarah over their daughter's head. There were no more tabloids, no more stalkers, and no more debt. There was only the steady, rhythmic pulse of a family that had been forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. "She's getting good," Marcus whispered to Sarah. "She has her father's determination and her mother's soul," Sarah replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. The story of the homeless mom and the lonely CEO had indeed become a legend, a story people told their children about why you should always be kind to strangers. But for them, it wasn't a legend. It was the truth of how 2 broken people had built a whole world out of a few notes played in the dark. As the sun set over the Chicago skyline, painting the room in hues of orange and gold, Lily finished her song. She looked at both of them, her eyes wide and hopeful. "Did I do it, Daddy? Did I play it right?" Marcus pulled them both into a hug, feeling the warmth and the life that now filled his every day. "You did it perfectly, Lily. You played it just right." The silence was gone forever. The music was home,